The New York Mets were founded in 1962, more than 60 years ago, and in that time, they have never had an MVP season from any player. I'm gonna be honest from the jump, Mets fans, this one may be brutal. The Mets have had many enigmatic players, especially in 1986 when they won their most current World Series title. Even right now, they have a candidate in Francisco Lindor who will most likely be the runner-up to Shohei Ohtani, who has put on an insane performance this year. This is certainly not the first time they have had a runner-up in an MVP race either. Only the Diamondbacks and Rays have had the same unfortunate distinction, and both teams are under 30 years old. However, expect steep competition from here on out with the Mets now acquiring Juan Soto. Things could change for the better sooner rather than later, Mets fans. But how in the world have they never had anyone take home the award, even with such high-caliber players like Darryl Strawberry, Mike Piazza, Gary Carter, David Wright, and a litany of Cy Young award-winning pitchers? From close calls to controversy, the Mets still remain as the oldest team to have never had an MVP player. Today, we will explore how and why this feat has never been achieved for any player of the New York Metropolitans. Before we can dig into specific players, as well as votes from the Baseball Writers Association of America, who decide the MVP each year, we will need to go into the history of the Mets along the way. After the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Giants left for California in 1957, the city of New York was on the brink of not having any National League team at all. But in 1962, the New York Mets were founded by William Shea as one of the league's first expansion teams. The Mets would come out of the gate putting up the now second worst record in the history of the league in their first season with 40 wins and a whopping 120 losses. Thank you, White Sox. Obviously no MVP candidates to speak of immediately. However, in their 8th season of existence in 1969, the Mets would win 100 games on top of getting a Cy Young performance from their first MVP vote-getter, Tom Seaver. This would be the first of many Cy Young seasons for Seaver. He flexed a 2.21 ERA, a 1.039 whip with a whopping 25-win season. In an extremely close call, he would finish second in MVP voting behind Willie McCovey, who had a wild offensive season in an era where pitchers dominated. Let's talk about how close the vote was for their first MVP candidate. They would both get 11 first-place votes apiece, but ultimately McCovey's 265 points would edge out Seaver's 243. This would be the first time the Mets had a chance to win an MVP award, and arguably the closest they would ever come to winning it in terms of votes. But the Mets would go on to upset the 109-win Baltimore Orioles in the 1969 World Series, becoming the first expansion team to win the division, the pennant, and the World Series.
In a heck of a ball game, Tom Seaver. This must be the most exciting moment in your life.
It is. It has to be, Tony. It's the greatest. I've wanted this for I don't know how long. I guess maybe 9 years old, but this is the most beautiful ball club I've ever seen. They're just fabulous. It's a pleasure to play with them. It really is.
Seaver hurled a 10-inning complete game while allowing only one run in Game 4 to ultimately seal the series as the Mets would take Game 5 at home the next day. Seaver would be a consistent MVP nominee over the next 7.5 years for the Mets. In that time, he would win 2 additional Cy Young awards while finishing 8th and 9th in 1973 and 1975, respectively. The Mets would also make it to the World Series in 1973, only to lose in a dramatic 7-game series to the Oakland A's. The Mets were actually up 3-2 as the series would go back to Oakland for Game 6. Seaver wouldn't get any run support in his Game 6 start, and the Mets lost the next day in Game 7. Things wouldn't get any better in the short term. In the coming years, the Mets began to decline, culminating on June 15, 1977, which became known as the Midnight Massacre. Seaver, who was in contract disagreements with Mets ownership, demanded a trade after negotiations soured. This was also on top of a New York Daily News reporter creating stories supposing Seaver to have asked for more money. The story claims Seaver's wife was jealous of the money Nolan Ryan was making at the time. A less than happy Seaver would be dealt to the Cincinnati Reds, and the Mets would not have a winning season or MVP candidate for the next 7 years. Now that was all pretty brutal, not going to lie, but things would soon start to look up. Let's get into the years of the Mets building to their second World Series. During this time, they should have easily won their first MVP, but instead experienced one of the largest snubs in MLB history. The 1980s run would ultimately be fueled by the team being sold to Doubleday Publishing, as Fred Wilpon would take over as the president of baseball operations in 1980. With him and Frank Cashen as GM, they would completely transform the Mets' outlook for the 1980s by drafting two perennial talents in Darryl Strawberry and Doc Gooden, as well as acquiring their next true MVP candidate via trade. That candidate was first baseman Keith Hernandez, who had actually won an MVP in 1979 with the St. Louis Cardinals. Hernandez was a highly touted defensive first baseman who was pivotal in taking the Mets a step forward in their chase to a World Series after he helped the Cardinals win in 1982.
I'm a baseball player, damn it. I'm Keith Hernandez.
Hernandez came over about 50 games into 1983 and would have another Gold Glove season while finishing 21st in MVP voting with 98 hits, a .424 on-base percentage, and an .858 OPS in his 95 games with the Mets. Things only got better in 1984 as the Mets would have their first winning season since trading Seaver, winning 90 games and finishing second in the NL East. Hernandez would arguably have his best season as a Met, winning another Gold Glove, a Silver Slugger award, and earning a starting spot on the NL All-Star team. He would finish the season with 171 hits, 31 doubles, a .311 batting average, and an .859 OPS. His 143 OPS plus would be his highest as a Met. However, as you could probably guess by the title of this video, he would finish second in MVP voting to the Cubs' Ryne Sandberg, who bested Hernandez in most stats while getting 200 hits along with 32 stolen bases as a second baseman. Hernandez would only get one first place vote in a year where no one in the NL really had a huge standout year offensively. But another Met would win Rookie of the Year, finishing 15th in MVP voting while being robbed for the Cy Young in '84. His name was Dwight Gooden, and he should have won the MVP in 1985. This unfortunately brings us to one of the largest MVP snubs in MLB history. Both Gooden and Hernandez would be at the top of MVP voting in 1985. But Gooden would finish the season with the highest WAR of any MLB player after 1923. Somehow, he didn't win the Mets an MVP even while finishing the year with a 12.2 pitching WAR and a 1.1 offensive WAR. A combined 13.3 WAR is obscene. For reference, here's a picture of all the MLB single-season WAR leaders of all time. Let's get into this while we are at it. BBWAA voting before the era of WAR was definitely sus at times. Things like batting average, home runs, and pitcher wins were given extraordinary value. OPS wouldn't become a popularized stat until 1984 thanks to John Thorne and Peter Palmer in their book The Hidden Game of Baseball. WAR wasn't really utilized until 2012. Gooden certainly should have won the MVP with his Cy Young season in 1985. I guess maybe the BBWA didn't want to have back-to-back pitcher MVP seasons after Willie Hernandez somehow won an MVP in 1984. I don't know, I really don't have words for this one. Mets fans, I really feel your pain. Look at the stats for Gooden in 1985, and it's pretty obvious how heavily he was robbed. Willie McGee? Really? Leave a comment below on if this was one of the largest snubs in MLB history. Regardless of Gooden's beyond legendary season, the Mets barely missed the playoffs in a year where they won 98 games after also acquiring Hall of Fame catcher Gary Carter. Carter and Hernandez were dominant in 1986, while being key pieces in a World Series run that culminated in Game 6 of the 1986 World Series. Buckner booted it, and the rest is history. The Mets would go on to win Game 7 the next day at home to capture their second and most recent World Series title. A number of Mets players would top MVP voting in 1986, including Gary Carter, Keith Hernandez, with 4 other players getting minor vote shares for a total of 6 Mets on the ballot. Mike Schmidt would ultimately take home the award. Cy Young winner Mike Scott of the Astros probably should have taken it, as he literally cheated and would cut the ball with a tack to doctor additional spin onto his pitches. But again, the BBWA probably didn't want a pitcher winning the MVP in each league, as Roger Clemens won the MVP for the AL in '86. Anyway, back to the Mets and life for them after winning their second World Series. Mets fans, this is where it may start to get rough. Darryl Strawberry would become the main MVP contender for the next few seasons, especially in 1988 when he narrowly lost to Kirk Gibson. Gibson and the Dodgers would take down the Mets in 7 games in the NLCS to go on to win the World Series. In the process, he would also go on to create one of the most iconic moments in baseball history. Definitely a real slap in the face to Darryl at that point. Although certainly deserved by Gibson, there wasn't a clear favorite to who would win statistically. Darryl led the NL in homers with 39, as well as OPS and slugging. Cases certainly could have been made for him, as well as Will Clark of the Giants. But ultimately, it would be another close call and season that wouldn't go the Mets' way. Mets left fielder Kevin McReynolds also finished third that year. After their brutal defeat in the 1988 NLCS, the Mets wouldn't make the postseason for the next 10 seasons. This was a long period defined by experimental rebuilding, managerial changes, winning followed by collapses, especially in 1991, and a lot of pranks for some reason. Along the way, Strawberry would finish third in MVP voting in 1990, losing to Barry Bonds, who would get his first MVP and begin his domination over the National League. The Mets wouldn't have anyone finish in top 3 voting from 1991 to 2000. Things bottomed out in 1993. The Mets lost 103 games, Doc Gooden was injured by Vince Coleman practicing his golf swing, and Coleman would eventually end his Mets tenure by catching a felony after throwing a firecracker out the team bus window at reporters, injuring 3 people. Obviously, it would have been real tough for things to have gotten worse from here. Luckily, things did get better as the 1990s progressed. The Mets would finally have a winning record in 1997, narrowly missing the playoffs by 4 games. This would also be the first occurrence of the Subway Series with the crosstown rival Yankees. The 1998 season brought the star power to the Mets that they had been lacking in catcher Mike Piazza. The Mets still missed the playoffs by only 1 game as they failed to win a single game against the Expos or Braves in the last 5 of the season. 1999, though, would finally get them back in MVP voting as Robin Ventura, Mike Piazza, and Edgardo Alfonso would finish 6th, 7th, and 8th respectively. The Mets would make their first playoff appearance since the 1988 NLCS loss, as they would make it back to the championship series to face the dominant Atlanta Braves. Although the Mets would come back from a 3-0 series deficit, they would ultimately lose in 6 games. The Braves of the 1990s were truly just a different animal, sadly. However, the Mets would flourish in 2000.
And the Mets are going back to the playoffs.
The lineup would feature 4 20-home run hitters, including Piazza, who would have his best season as a Met. He slugged 38 homers and 113 RBIs with a 1.12 OPS. Piazza would have had a great shot for the MVP if not for Barry Bonds and Jeff Kent dominating the year for the Giants. Go figure, the team that the Mets replaced would stymie a prime MVP chance for them. Certainly poetic and depressing. Jeff Kent would take home the award with Todd Helton getting snubbed pretty heavily in my opinion. The Mets would get their revenge on the Giants though as they beat them in 4 games in the NLDS 3-1. They blew past the Cardinals in the NLCS as well to make their 4th World Series appearance and 1st since 1986. Unfortunately, it happened to be against none other than the New York Yankees looking for a three-peat. The series would not really be close as the Yankees cruised to their 3rd World Series in a row in 5 games. Unfortunately, it would be a long time before the Mets would be back. The Mets wouldn't make the World Series for the next 15 years. They have also not had a top 3 MVP vote getter since Piazza in 2000. This certainly shouldn't have been the case with Carlos Beltran becoming a beast for the Mets, especially in 2006. He should have finished 2nd or 3rd, but the MVP winner Ryan Howard hit 58 homers. Still, Pujols probably had the best case to win besides Howard, even with Beltran finishing with an 8.2 WAR, 41 homers, and 118 RBIs. The Mets would make the NLCS, but lose to the eventual champion Cardinals in 7 games. Like I said before, coming up just short is the painful theme for this video. The Mets wouldn't be back in the playoffs until 2015. Realistically, in 2007, David Wright or Albert Pujols probably should have finished higher than they did, but cases could be made for a number of players. Ultimately, Jimmy Rollins had 38 doubles, 20 triples, 20 homers, 212 hits, 41 stolen bases, and a near 300 batting average as a shortstop, which is a defense-first position. Rollins won the Gold Glove, a Silver Slugger, and most likely deserved the MVP, although like I said, cases could have been made for Pujols or Wright. Another debatable tally that wouldn't go the Mets' way. Wright would get another shot in 2012, but Buster Posey would take home the crown after an insane 7.6 WAR season while batting .331 as a catcher. The bad luck just can't seem to escape Wright, although he would finish 3rd in WAR in the NL, but not even finish top 5 in voting, ending up in 6th. The Mets wouldn't have another true MVP candidate until 2018, even with high-caliber players like Yoenis Cespedes, Curtis Granderson, and Jacob deGrom on their roster for the 2015 World Series run. They were bested by the Royals that year as the Mets continued to chase their first World Series title since 1986. Let's get into their final snub with DeGrom's 2018 Cy Young performance. This is another one that is pretty egregious as DeGrom led all of the NL with a 9.9 WAR and an MLB-leading 1.7 ERA over 217 innings pitched that year. With a league-leading 1.98 FIP and 218 ERA+, he was easily a top 3 candidate at the very least. He would somehow finish 5th with one first-place vote. Christian Yelich had a pretty awesome year with a 7.3 WAR, leading the Brewers to a playoff run in his first year in Milwaukee, but the BBWAA really botched this one. DeGrom was also robbed and added another chapter in a sad story of what-ifs. That brings us to this year, where Francisco Lindor will unfortunately come up short while almost single-handedly leading the Mets to a wild-card berth. He would easily take home the award if not for Shohei Ohtani moving to the NL this year. Lindor had his best regular season as a Met and called game in the Mets wildcard clinching game in Atlanta. He would also do the same in the NLDS against Philly. He also had by far his best season as a Met with a career-high O WAR, 73 extra base hits, and stellar defense. But barring injury or Ohtani defecting to the Mets, they will most likely have a very difficult time ending this bad luck streak in the MVP polls as long as Ohtani is in the NL. Throughout the history of the franchise, the MVP caliber players for the Mets have had bad luck, close calls, and many cases of wrong place, wrong time. Time will only tell when the Mets will earn their first MVP award in the 62-year history of the franchise. But statistically, it has to happen at some point, right? Thanks, y'all. This has been Baseball Casual. Please leave a like and a comment if you enjoyed the video, and don't forget to subscribe for future content.